Thanks so much for joining the Research in Action talk yesterday. Unfortunately, during that talk, there wasn't enough time for me to answer all of the questions that came in over Zoom. So what I wanted to do today was just to really read through the questions that came in, and I'm going to try to answer those as best I can. So let's see here. So the first question was, what ethical issues do you explore? Are there concerns over malicious use, privacy, informed consent, etc.? And if you do, can you explain how? So this is a very good question, an important question. And one of the things that Karen and I talked about briefly after the presentation yesterday was that I'm so happy that so many good questions came in about privacy and security. These are important questions. We're talking about monitoring people in public spaces. If we don't ask the important, the challenging questions about ethics, about security, about privacy, we're bound to get it wrong. So I'm really grateful that folks are asking these. Yes, absolutely. We are concerned about malicious use. We're concerned about privacy. We're concerned about security. So I'm gonna talk about two things. So one is that in advance of the project beginning, we worked with the city of West Palm Beach to work through, talk through, think about what are the sensitivities that we're likely to encounter. How do we make sure that we're following best practices? How do we make sure that we're using this data in ways that the public will be comfortable with? So that took a variety of forms. We spent a lot of time talking with the city commission, with individual commissioners. We spoke with the public at an open forum. We participated in a working session with the city commission. So we spent a good amount of time listening to what people were concerned about and understanding what people were looking for in terms of ensuring privacy. And that's really where the foundation of our plan came from, was based on the sensitivities we learned from these conversations. So in a nutshell, privacy is protected by never identifying individuals, by never collecting any information about data traffic. So your phone and your watch and all your other smart devices, they send out a numeric code that identifies your device, but not you. So it's only that code that we capture and that we record. Now, I wanna correct my last statement there just a bit. We don't actually record that raw number that comes from your phone. We take that number, we put it through a function that turns it into another number that looks random. It's a random number which can't be used to identify your specific phone. And it's only that number, which does not identify you or your phone, that we record. So what ends up getting recorded is, in effect, just a bunch of unnamed dots on a screen that are milling about space. That's what ends up being recorded. So that's how we address this. Now, every bit of information that we collect, everything is made public immediately at the point that we collect it. So we've tried to adopt a practice of radical transparency so that everyone, the public, our research team, the city, that everyone can see what we're collecting, how we're collecting it. And so if there are ever any concerns that we didn't anticipate, folks could bring those to our attention and we could address them. So that's been our approach. Really, I think the only way to address data collection in public spaces is to understand the community-specific concerns, the community-specific sensitivities, and then to work with those individual communities to ensure that your data collection and storage and use practices are consistent with community values. And that's what we believe we have done in the city of West Palm Beach. That's what we will continue to try to do in the city of West Palm and in other cities where we hopefully will have the opportunity to engage in similar projects. So the second question, what type of safeguards are in place to make sure my data from my phone or watch is not misused by our government hackers or university professors, the most important? So another good question, really trying to get at a similar point, I think. And the short answer here is that we don't collect any information whatsoever about data from your phone. So we don't collect any information about the websites you visit, about the content that comes to your phone. We don't collect any information about contacts, nothing like that. It is strictly that beacon that comes from your phone that says, I am here. So it's really, when you want to conceptualize what's being collected, we're collecting dots on a map and how those dots move over time. That's it. Now, in general, how do you make sure, so perhaps the question is not specific to our project, but in general, how do I, as a citizen, how do I make sure that my data isn't misused by the government or by hackers or by the most nefarious, the university professors? I would say that my best answer is that the reason that most privacy safeguards fail and that most security safeguards fail, it's not because there's a technical limitation in the gadget, in the computer, in the watch, or in the phone, or whatever it is. It's because people don't adopt best practices for setting passwords, for changing passwords, for enabling dual factor authentication. So my recommendation to everyone on how do you make sure that others do not have access to data that you don't want them to have access to, it's use strong passwords, change those passwords regularly, use dual factor authentication when you can. At home, secure your networks. Don't have an open network, have a private network, which is password protected with a strong password that others are not likely to guess. So if your password on your home network is password, you're doing it wrong. You have to, you've got to strengthen the passwords. That's my recommendation on that. So the next question, how is privacy treated in West Palm Beach? Privacy is very important. It's a sensitive issue. I absolutely couldn't agree more. I view myself as a little bit of a privacy nut. I do not like the idea of folks being able to, I do not like folks to be able to take a peek at video traffic, at what my children are watching on the TV at home, on voice communications. That makes me completely crazy. I'm very sensitive to the issue. In the context of West Palm Beach, I hope I've addressed this question. If not, shoot me an email and I'm happy to correspond by email. But we don't collect any information that could reveal anything about you other than location, and it's not your location, it's a dot on a screen. So it's the location of some resident or some visitor in the city at this point in time, but it's not tied to your home, it's actually not tied to your device. It's just a point in space so that we have an understanding of how our public spaces are being used and how people move about through that space. And actually, I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about this. So, so I mentioned I have concerns about internet privacy, and I'll tell you where that began. So, I was in my home, and every morning before I come to work, I watch do-it-yourself videos. And it happened that this one day I was looking at do-it-yourself videos on prosthetics, on how to make movie prosthetics for monsters and all the rest. So later that day, I was in the car and I borrowed my son's cell phone to look something up on the internet, and I got a recommendation for creature prosthetics videos, and I thought this is completely crazy. Now I'm not going to get into sort of how did that information become revealed to the recommendation engines, but suffice to say that made me uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable that folks can take a peek into data traffic and learn things about us, about our families. And so I think that the questions that folks have asked here are extremely important. I'm glad you're asking them. Okay, so the next question, I've rambled on a little bit. With the use of smart devices as data collection points for tracking disease or infections, can you talk about how to manage privacy issues? Yes, so importantly, in the work that we're doing for forecasting potential disease transmission at the level of a streetscape, we're only doing simulation and forecasting. We don't have any information whatsoever on who might have the disease or how that disease might spread. Now, I will say that there is the significant potential for using mobile devices to support traceability monitoring. So the Bluetooth chip in particular in your cell phone, and not just the Bluetooth chip, this is just one way to do it, but the Bluetooth chip in your cell phone has the ability to measure the proximity to other Bluetooth chips. So you can imagine that when your phone is in your pocket and you're talking to one of your friends and the friend is maybe 5 foot away or something like that, your phone can detect that you're 5 foot away, and your phone could be programmed to know who you're speaking with that's 5 foot away. So then you can kind of quickly see that if all of our phones had this capacity enabled, our phones would have the ability to understand our social networks. And I don't mean our social networks like this like, you know, Facebook and all the other stuff. Our true social networks of the physical people we interact with and how close we get to those people and how long we stay within 2 or 3 feet of these people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's a very powerful tool that can be used for a lot of good in the era of COVID-19. But obviously, this is also a tool which can be used for great harm. So as it happens, you may want to do a search for what Google and Apple are doing in this space. So Google and Apple, of course, they have great capacity to enable this kind of technology in Android phones and in iPhones. And indeed, this is something that they're looking at. And I have to say, I think they've taken a very strong, positive position in protecting that data and how that data may be used. Because of course, the thing we all fear is surveillance capitalism, right? So what we don't want is we don't want Google and Apple collecting information about us and then selling that information about us without us having some say in how that data is shared and how that data is used. And so I think Google and Apple have taken a very strong position that that gives a very narrow focus for how that geolocation, that traceability data may be used by public health authorities. This is not my area of expertise. This is just something that I'm interested in. I'd encourage you to take a look at what Google and Apple are doing in terms of traceability and privacy. I think it's quite exciting. Next question, how secure is the cloud that all of this data is stored in? So I'll say that we adopt best practices for data security, for authentication with our cloud services, but I'll also say that it doesn't matter a whole lot. And it doesn't matter a whole lot because of this radical transparency policy that we've adopted. So because all of the data that we collect is immediately made public, safeguarding it in the cloud is sort of secondary importance to us in some sense, because everything we collect is immediately publicly available. What kind of data is being collected? That's the next question. So again, in the Mobility Intelligence Project, which is what I think that this question is asking about, the only information that's collected is point in space. So where is the device at this point in time and how does it move throughout the city? That's the only information that's being collected. In our other projects, so for example, in our water quality monitoring project, we collect a pretty wide array of physical parameters. So this is dissolved oxygen, it's turbidity, it's pH. We collect information about nutrients within the water, which are not physical parameters, but we collect information about specific nutrients. In our atmospheric programs, we collect all the kind of usual weather station parameters. So we're interested in wind direction, we're interested in precipitation, we're interested in temperature, humidity, solar radiation, we're interested in some cases in soil temperature and in soil moisture. So the data that we collect varies pretty significantly from one application to another. So the next question. I answered this question yesterday, or I tried to answer this question yesterday. Perhaps I answered it poorly, but the question is, what are your thoughts and perspectives on the increase of smart devices in cities, and how can it affect our overall health as it relates to radiation? Or better yet, do you know if there's an increase in radiation as smart cities are implemented? I know that as smart cities are implemented and there's more and more wireless traffic, we have more we have more sort of bits floating around in the air. I'm afraid that this falls pretty squarely outside of my expertise. Do I believe personally that the RF traffic presents a health hazard? My personal belief is that no, I do not believe it presents a health hazard. But that's just my personal belief. I'm not an expert. I'm not a health expert. I don't have any expertise whatsoever in this. So I'm giving you just my feeling. My feeling is that no, we're probably healthy. If I get sick, I'll change my view. So let's see here. The next question. It seems it would be easy to track a number to its home address and thus discover the homeowner's ID from their phone. Since this info is to be publicly shared, how do you protect individuals from stalkers who may have access to the technology? Another fantastic question. I'm going to mention again that after the call, Karen and I were talking, after the presentation yesterday, Karen and I were talking, and I mentioned to her that it's so important that people ask these types of questions because they help us to understand vulnerabilities that we didn't initially see. As it happens, this is one such vulnerability that was asked of us much earlier in the implementation of this project. Someone had brought this point up. We said, well, look, we're tracking dots in space and they have these fake numbers which can't be identified to their cell phone. We're hiding all identity data. This is private. And someone raised this question and said, well, if you monitor neighborhoods and you see this dot in space that frequently visits the same home, could you not infer the identity of that dot based on the home that it visits most frequently? And I thought, absolutely you could. It's just that was something we hadn't thought of. And so the outcome of that conversation was that we will only monitor in public spaces. We cannot monitor in interior spaces. We have to be very selective in what we monitor. And so right now what we're monitoring is down the stretch of clematis. We're not monitoring in buildings. We basically have to have blackout areas where we do not collect data because it could indeed reveal the kind of information that this person has asked. It's a really spectacularly good question. So that's that one. Can this technology reduce emissions and help climate change? I think the answer is yes, absolutely. So one of the points I tried to make yesterday is that we spend a lot of time talking about smart cities. And when we think about smart cities, these smart cities are big data warehouses. So smart cities are cities that are instrumented with sensors everywhere. And these sensors are collecting information about how we use water and how we use electricity and where we drive. And then we can optimize all that. So we can optimize how much water we're using, how much energy we're using, how we drive, and all kind of everything in between. But we often forget that cities are not about things. And it's things called the Internet of Things, right? But cities aren't about things. Cities are about people. It's people who have the greatest impact on these efficiencies we're trying to achieve. It's people who will use less water. It's people who will use less energy. It's people who will choose to ride bikes or to ride scooters rather than to drive their cars into the cities. And those decision points can't be automated. So I'm giving a long-winded answer here, but I think that the answer is yes. Can this help to reduce emissions? 100% yes. We already have fantastic examples of how sensors are being used to understand when cars should speed up or brake so as to avoid traffic lights downstream. And you can see significant reductions in fuel consumption, significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, just as a result of allowing the car to determine when to accelerate based on when traffic lights will stall them upstream. So that's where automation can help. And there are many other examples. But we also make the best decisions about our behaviors when we understand how our behaviors affect our health and wellness and the health and wellness of our friends and our neighbors and our communities. So there's some group of people who would hear that statement and they'll say, that's naive. We just knowing how our behaviors affect others is not going to make people change. But that's absolutely false. So we have a burgeoning smart device market, wearables market, that's all about understanding our heart rates, our breathing, how much we move, and we're all willing to walk a couple of extra steps to get that gold star on our Fitbit. And so we believe fundamentally that if we have better information about how our own behaviors affect our health indicators, we will make better decisions about our health and likewise about our neighbors. So I think that there's a significant opportunity in smart cities to take the information that's being collected and to feed that information back to residents, to visitors, to citizens, so they can understand how their behaviors affect others. And that's really the foundation of our food waste reduction project, is that if we understand how our food purchasing and food waste behaviors are affecting our community, we're more likely to make good decisions about how much food we take. And I think that same example can be applied to energy, to water consumption. I think that it can be applied to litter reduction. I think it can be applied to lots and lots of areas where having more information presented in the right way about how our behaviors affect the people we care about can have a significant impact on health, on wellness, on the environment. So yes, I think this technology can help to reduce emissions. I think it can indeed help to resolve environmental problems. Okay, the next question. For epidemic tracking, how would you in the population, how would you monitor who is infected and who is not? How would you track their movement? So just as a clarification, our technology in the space of COVID monitoring or disease modeling in general, we don't have any technology today in our shop that's focused on understanding who is sick or who has been infected. We're not doing anything right now with traceability monitoring. That's not something that we're engaged in. So right now we don't have any technology in our shop to monitor who is sick or to follow them. So nothing like that. But hypothetically, how would you do that? And it's actually not hypothetical. So there are already startup companies and actually large companies who are kind of moving into ambient health monitoring, who are building technologies to try to identify who is ill and who is not remotely. Most of this technology is based on thermal imaging. So these are cameras that are mounted outside of buildings. I suspect that, and this is just speculation, but I suspect that in the fall of 2020, when all of our children go back to school, I suspect we're going to see a huge number of thermal cameras outside and inside school buildings all over the country to in an ambient kind of way, identify who has a temperature and who does not. I'm sure we're going to see this at airports. I know that these have been installed in a number of airports already. I expect that that's going to be very, very widely dispersed. So that's the primary mechanism. Excuse me. Any thoughts on issues relating to the disposal of these IoT devices as they become obsolete? It's another great question. This is a concern. These devices right now, these devices are not biodegradable. We don't have any technology that we've constructed in here, in the shop here, that are biodegradable. There are teams, not at FAU, but at other universities that are working on biodegradable circuitry. I think we have a long way to go before we get to that point. So when we talk about doing large-scale instrumentation of the oceans, for example, this is something we have to think very seriously about. Right now, what that means is that we have to have a plan for locating devices after they've been deployed and for collecting them and removing them. Further out, there is a drive for biodegradable electronics, but again, I think we're pretty far off from that. How many years? I don't know. It's not my area, but my intuition, my feeling, which is not based on science, it's just my feeling, is that we're decades away from having devices which are purely biodegradable. Okay, the last question. I understand that you create a number, but you're also saying that the information is publicly shared, so there is no protection for the individual. So again, just to clarify that point, when we collect the number that comes from your cell phone, let's just say hypothetically the number that comes from this cell phone is a bunch of ones. It's not, but let's just say that it's a bunch of ones. Our algorithm takes that group of ones and turns it into a random number that cannot be inverted to identify the serial number of this device. So the number that we store within the database in which we make publicly available has no relationship that can be determined to your telephone. It's a number which is generated based on your phone, but which cannot be inverted to identify your phone. That technology, if you're interested in reading a little bit more about that, that technology is called a one-way hash function. That's the tech that we use. So I hope that I've answered the questions that folks have had. Again, it was a pleasure to have a chance to share this information with folks yesterday. Really enjoyed it. If I didn't answer your questions or you have other questions, please shoot me an email. I'd be happy to answer any other questions you might have or clarify some things that I said or perhaps said incorrectly. So again, thanks very much.